Well, anyway, let's begin. Good to see all of you. Good morning.
Morning.
The Gemara that we learned yesterday, we spoke about putting not putting tefillin on, but saying Shema with if there's a bad smell. Saying Shema with if there's a reach ra. So we spoke about two types of bad smells. There's a reach ra, bad smell, sheyesh lo ikar, that has a source. And then we spoke about saying Shema and there's a bad smell, but there is no source. And
there is a source, but it's unknown.
Thank you, Ben, for clarifying the scientific meaning. But what we're dealing with is basically what is appropriate, at least if a person is isn't able to move away from this bad smell. Is it appropriate for them to say Shema? And when we spoke about the Reach Rashi Yesh Le Ikar, when it has the source, meaning that there's a visible source of this bad smell. So we had one of these arguments between Rav Huna and Rav Chizda, which we've been having. We've seen a few arguments, and Rav Huna is always the more lenient view in these scenarios. And Rav Huna says that as long as you separate 4 amos, 6 to 8 feet from the source, so even if there is a bad smell, according to Rashi, doesn't matter. You could say the Shema even with the bad smell. The main thing is you're away from the source of the bad smell. According to the Rambam, it means you would separate from the source of the bad smell of the source as long as you don't have a bad smell near you. But you don't have to separate 4 amos from the bad smell. You separate 4 amos from the source of the bad smell. And then as long as you don't have the bad smell near you, even if it's smellable one amma away from you, that's not a problem according to Rav Huna. So again, Rashi would hold even if you have the bad smell. Rambam holds even if the bad smell is within 4 amos of you, it's fine as long as the source is away 4 amos. That's Rav Huna's view. And Rav Chizda says that you need to go 4 amos away from the smell. That means besides being away from the source of the smell, you also have to go 4 amos away from the smell. So here again, we have Rav Chizda being more strict and Rav Huna being more lenient. And then we spoke about, the Gemara brought a brisa, and it spoke about all different types of excrement from animals, from different types of animals and so on. And then it mentioned interesting halacha if a person's high up or much lower, because they're considered in their own reshus, they're in their own domain. And these laws of domain do have a lot to do with laws of Shabbos as well. The laws of Shabbos, when you carry something from one domain to another, there are laws of if there's a platform and it's 10 tefachim high, if it would be considered like a separate domain. And so the law of domain is a law that's not only here, it applies in many laws. And the brisa that mentions this law, it also mentions that the opinion of Rav Chizda that a person has to separate 4 amos from the smell, not only from the source of the smell, but also anywhere where the smell is, you have to go 4 amos away from the smell. And then Rava said that we don't paskin like one part of this brisa, and what that referred to was that there was something that's really smelly, he says, is not the actual excrement from dogs and pigs, but it's actually when they put the parchment, the skin, the hides from the animal and they put it inside the excrement. That's when it really smells bad, and that's when it's prohibited to say Shema nearby. Now, then we spoke about Reach Rasha Ein Lai Ikar, a bad smell that doesn't have a source. And we said that they asked Rav Sheshes this question. And Rav Sheshes said, well, you look in the yeshiva, you look in the base medrash, in the place where they learn. They have these mats that people study on, and they also sleep on. And so people are sleeping next to other people studying, and obviously it's not a problem to learn Torah, even if there's. So in other words, a bad smell that doesn't have a source means passing gas, and people pass gas when they're sleeping, and other people are sitting there and learning in this base medrash. Obviously, it's permitted. So this is his source, that this is his answer, that it's permissible to study Torah in a place where there is a bad smell if there's no source of the bad smell. And then he said, but that only applies to Torah, it doesn't apply to Shema. So if we take that statement and try to compare it and contrast it with the previous statement of the Gemara that we just learned, what comes out is that the previous Gemara, Rav Huna said, according to Rashi, that it's permissible, even if there's a bad smell, as long as you're 4 amos, you're 4 cubits away from the source of the bad smell. But even if there's a bad smell where you are, it's not a problem. So how is Rav Huna going to learn this Gemara where it says that if there's a bad smell for Shema, you cannot recite Shema? There's no source. So you're more than 4 amos away from the source because there is no source. So why can't you say Shema in such a place? So the commentaries understand that Rashi is learning that Rav Sheshes follows Rav Chisda. Rav Sheshes and Rav Chisda follow each other. They're following the same opinion. And I'm just looking it up over here. Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshes were both in the 3rd generation of Amoraim, and Rav Huna was actually in the 2nd generation. That's what I had mentioned yesterday, that really Rav Huna is the teacher of Rav Chisda. Nevertheless, there are opinions that we paskin like the student. There are 2 opinions here who we paskin like, but there is such a view. In any event, according to Rashi, you have to learn that Rav Sheshes is following Rav Chisda and not Rav Huna. So Rav Huna would hold in this scenario that you could even say Shema in a place where there is a bad smell if there's no source of it. That would be according to Rashi. According to the Rambam, it would still have to be the Rambam. According to the Rambam, it's not a problem. It fits very well because the way the Rambam learned the previous Gemara is that we're talking about a case where there's no bad smell where you are. You just don't have to separate 4 amos from the smell. And here also, Rav Sheshes doesn't say you need to separate 4 amos from where the smell is. All you have to do is make sure the smell isn't where you are. As long as you don't smell it, it is permissible to say Shema. So that fits very well, even with Rav Huna in the way the Rambam explains it. So that was with regard to Torah learning in regard to Shema. And then we mentioned that even for Torah learning, that applies to someone else who passes gas, but the person himself, he would have to wait until the smell goes away for him to continue studying Torah. And now we're up to the next Gemara. We're on page Chaf Hey Amud Aleph. We're in 25a, and we are the second word on the line, Itmar. It's about halfway down the page. Yes, Ezra.
So in other Gemaras where they're talking about a minyan of tanners, in which, as we all know, tanners did not smell very great. So what do you do in a situation where, do we then say that if you have a minyan of tanners, since all of the tanners have the same smell and you can't smell, then you can daven, say Kriyat Shema, say Tefillah, irrespective of whether or not, because you don't smell what they smell like?
Yeah, I'd have to look it up, what the law is about. The Gemara does talk about if a person marries someone and they want to, is the husband allowed to go into the tanning field, or is or is it considered, if he's a tanner, is that considered that he he fooled her, he tricked her to like she accepted marriage. They agreed on marriage on a false information, like she didn't have the full information because but anyway, the question you're asking about davening and minyan of tanners, I'm not familiar with it. I'd have to look it up in Shulchan Aruch, and I guess we could try to find. I mean, I have a. Let me just see if this. I'll take one look here and see if it touches on it, but I doubt it because our Gemara doesn't. It's not the main point of our Gemara. That would be other Gemaras. But I'll just take a look here for you just to see if they quote anything about the laws of tanners.
You know, if you're in that kind of business, you're not going to realize that you smell bad because everybody smells the same.
I'll just read to you what it brings over here. The excrement of a dog and a pig, if there's leather hides in it, so you have to separate from it just like from a person's excrement. But if it doesn't have it, then the law is like other animals that you don't have to separate as long as there's no smell. There's no bad smell. Now, if they do have a bad smell, then it's considered just like a human excrement. And some say that even if it has a bad smell, it's not considered, so it's not as extreme, and it'll stop, and therefore you don't have to separate for amos. You could just go until where the smell ends. So that's basically all it says. Again, because our Gemara is not talking about tanners, the people who do the tanning. We're talking about saying Shema, near the work that they're doing. But what Ezra is asking is, if people who work in that field, they also, it's hard for them to clean themselves from the smell. And he wants to know about a minyan, people davening near them and so on. So I'm not familiar with those laws. I would have to look it up in Shulchan Aruch, so maybe I'll try to check it out. Yes, Ben.
I think I want to clarify something. It looks to me like Sheshet does not agree even with Chizda.
Rav Sheshet and Rav Chizda.
Right, Rav Sheshet doesn't agree with Rav Chizda on everything because he says if it's your own, you can't even say Divrei Torah. If the smell comes from you, not your friends, but Chizda didn't make the differentiation.
Rav Chizda,
I say, yeah. Rav Chizda did not make the differentiation between somebody else's smell and your own smell.
Yeah, but Rav Chizda did not discuss the case of Reach Ra She'ein Lo Iker. He didn't discuss this case. This is a different case than he talked about. We're talking about a case where there's no source. Rav Chizda spoke about cases of a source, where there was a source. So it's not you can't really. Yeah.
Okay, I see the difference.
Okay. Itmar. So we're now right in the middle of the page. Itmar, we learned in the Beis Medrash, Soya Oiveres. If there's excrement that someone is carrying through nearby, and you are in the midst of saying Shema, or you want to start saying Shema, and someone's carrying. So we had the opposite case before, where you're walking in a mavuais hatunufais. You're walking in an area that's disgusting, that's dirty. That is what we had previously, such cases. Now we're talking about where the excrement is passing through and you're stationary. So in this scenario, the halacha is possibly more strict. Again, the other scenario, we had reason to be more lenient because your camp, where you are, it's not considered where you're walking through because you're not really settled. But here, because you're settled, so therefore, this is considered your area. and when that person brings through that the excrement, it's considered that it's possibly considered a problem because you're stationary in your camp. There is excrement. On the other hand, the excrement is passing through. So therefore, there's reason to say maybe you could be a little lenient because it's not planning on stopping here. It's continuing. They're throwing it out or whatever. So that's the question here. Tsoya Iveres, it's passing through. Abaye Amar Mutar Likras Kriya Shema, you would be allowed to say Kriya Shema. Abaye says, Rava Amar, Rava says, Asur Likras Kriya Shema, person is not allowed to say Kriya Shema, opposite it. Now, there are two opinions if this refers to if it's in front of you or on the side of you. If it's, you have to separate 4 amos. You have to separate 4 cubits. But what does that refer to? Does this refer to if it's in front of you? And which would mean that because it's traveling, normally you're not allowed to, has to be beyond your eyes' ability to see it. And here it seems that 4 amos might be acceptable because it's moving. If it was stationary, you wouldn't be allowed to say Shema when it's in front of you. But here there might be room for leniency because it's moving. And there are 2 opinions. There's the Beis Yosef and the Tur, how they understand the Rambam. But basically, one of them explains it that we're talking about that it's in front of you, and even so, all you have to do is separate 4 amos. The other opinion is that we're talking about of course, it's not in front of you, it's on the side or it's behind you, and therefore it would be 4 amos. That would be the reason for 4 amos. If it would be in front of you, you'd have to separate the measurement of kamale enov, the amount of the space that it would, that you don't see it. So this is the opinion of Rava, that it's prohibited to say Shema when it's traveling, just like if it was stationary. So now Abaye is going to say, where is my source? Amar Abaye says, Ma Minolo. From where do I say this? From where am I coming up with this law? Titanan, because there's a Mishnah. Titanan, we learned in a Mishnah, Hatame Oimed Tachas Oilan, a person who has saras, a person who is impure, and he's impure with leprosy, biblical leprosy. And because of it, and so he is now stationary. The impure person is stationary. He's Oimed Tachas Oilan, in Vahatahar Oiver Sham. And the pure person, the person who's not Tameh, doesn't have leprosy, he's passing through where the Tameh person is standing under the tree. So the Tameh person is standing stationary under a tree. The Tahar person, the pure person, is walking. And the law is Tameh, he becomes Tameh. The Tahar person becomes Tameh. Tahar Oimed Tachas Oilan. What happens if the pure person is stationary, standing under the tree? Tameh over, and the Tameh person is passing through. So here it's similar maybe to our case, just like you have excrement passing through. Here you have a Tameh person, a person who is called a Metzaira. He has saras, he has leprosy, and he's passing through. And the law is Tahar, the person who's stationary is Tahar. The man who's standing there who was pure before, he stays pure. So what we see is that as long as the negative thing, the thing that's impure, is traveling, it doesn't really have an influence on the person who's stationary. So Abaye says the same thing applies to excrement that's traveling. I'm stationary. I'm gonna I'm saying Shema, and that's just traveling through. Even if I was a Metzaira, even if that person was a Metzaira, he's passing through. The person standing still is tar, is pure. So he's bringing this comparison to try to prove that you could say Shema even if the Tsoya is passing through. Vim Ahmad, what happens if the person who's a Matzaira, the person who has leprosy, if he stands still and he doesn't continue walking, what happens if he stops? Tameh, then the person becomes Tameh, because now he's near you, he's stationary, and so you don't have this leniency. But when he's traveling through, it's not a problem. But then the Gemara says, the same thing would be a stone that has tzaras, it has a nega, and the stone person is carrying it, has the same laws. If he stops, if he's moving, it would be the same laws as a person who has tzaras and the stone that has tzaras. So what comes out is that Abaye seems to see from this Mishnah that when you have traveling a Matzaira, which is similar to traveling excrement, if it's still moving, it doesn't have an impact on the stationary things that are there. It doesn't make it tameh. It won't make it won't make you prohibited to say Shema. So that's the comparison that Abaye makes. Rava Amar Lach, and Rava will tell you that there's a difference. Anyone here? Anyone can think of a difference? Why we should separate? Why we should consider them different types of cases? Yes, Ben. You're muted.
Ben, you're muted.
You're muted.
I thought that when the Tameh is sitting, that's his camp, and the Tahor is passing through the camp of the Tameh. And the other way, the Tameh is passing by, and that's it.
Okay, I'm looking for a difference between the laws of Shema and the laws of Matzaira, the laws of Tzaras. That there's a difference. In one case, basically what we have here is that the laws, we're comparing laws of Tzaras with laws of saying with dirt, laws of excrement. So the Gemara here says there's a difference. That Dechsiv, as it says, Hassam, I'm sorry, let me read this again. Rava Amar Lach, and Rava says, but we'll tell you that there's a difference. Hassam over there, when we're talking about Tzaras, it depends on where the Tameh person, the impure person who's has tzaras, he has leprosy, where he is established. Dechsiv, as it says, Badad Yeshev, he's supposed to dwell alone. Michutz lamachane moishavai, his moishav, his place of dwelling, of staying, is outside of the camp. So we see it's all about his moishav, his dwelling. And
is that what you're talking about? The domain?
The domain.
Okay.
His domain. What's called his domain? So as long as his domain, as long as that's his domain, that's a problem. And if it's not his domain, it's not a problem. So therefore, if he is walking, if a Tameh person is walking, therefore it's not his domain, he's not going to make the person who's standing stationary Tameh, because that's not the Tameh person's domain. He's just walking through. Hacha here, V'haya machanecha kadosh. It's all about your camp being holy. That you want to say Shema, and you have dirt coming into your camp. The dirt is there, so it says, yeah, your camp should be holy. Amar Rachmana, the Torah says, v'haleka, and you don't have that, because the fact is there is shmutz in your camp. Is it staying there? Maybe not, but it's there. The fact is it's there. So it's all about the factual. The fact is it's right there. And
I think V'haya machanecha kadosh means that when shmutz is traveling through, it does not affect it because it's not part of machanecha. That's his whole point. that
No.
because
Rava's.
I mean, Taras is place related. It has to be fixed to a place. And if your machanecha is fine, but the shmutz is going through, you're okay. It doesn't apply. But if the shmutz is in your camp, then it's related to the place. Then you have a problem.
Yeah, but this is Rava saying this, and Rava says Aser likreis kriya shema kenegda. Rava said that it's Aser to say Shema when the shmutz is passing through, and he's explaining that even though when a Mitzayra passes through, it's not a problem because that's not his Moishav, but the Shmutz passing through, it is ruining your camp because this is your camp. And even though it's not a kvios of his Shmutz, but the fact is your camp is not pure anymore. So therefore you would not be allowed to say Shema. In other words, your camp has to be clean. And if the shmutz is passing through, it doesn't matter if it's stationary or if it's moving. The fact is, your camp, it's all about your camp. Your camp should be kadosh, and you don't v'haleka, and you don't have that because there is shmutz there.
Correct. I read it wrong.
No problem. So, Amar. So that's the two opinions. So we basically explained two opinions, Baye and Rava, about if there's shmutz traveling through, if you would be allowed to say Shema or not. Yes, Susan.
If I'm on the train traveling in downtown Miami and it smells, I have to stop in the middle of Shema because of my camp is not holy.
You might have to. It depends what it depends who we hold like, and it depends what the source is. What is the source of that smell? If you can tell what the source is, that might help you. That might is the shmutz covered or not as well? Could be room for leniency as well if it's covered. But the point is that if you see it, it's definitely an issue. If you see what the source of the shmutz is, and you might want to go to a different
way, get out of there, right? Okay,
a different car. Okay,
really?
Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, Pi chazir titzaya iverastam. The mouth of a pig is like excrement. And if a person walks by a pig, or if a pig walks by you, you would not be allowed to say Shema. So it's actually the case is a pig walking by you because we're trying to say tsaya iveras. We're talking about if the excrement is moving. So here we have a case of excrement moving. And what is that? Where a pig walks by, but he doesn't have excrement on his mouth. But nevertheless, it is considered like excrement passing through, and it would be the same halacha.
There is always excrement on his mouth.
One second, don't say that. The Gemara asks, Shita, of course. What's this? Of course, right? It's obvious that his mouth is always excrement, like Isaac just said. And the Gemara answers like tzricha, not necessary, but except for this case. We're saying to tell you a special case. Afal gav de solik minahara. Even though he came out of the water, so he just washed himself. Even so, he is considered to be, we consider him to be like he has soya, like he has excrement. Now, I'm not sure if this means that it's impossible to clean his mouth, or because his mouth has it so much, it's like a toilet that always has excrement in it, meaning even if it's clean, it's still not clean. Even if it's clean, it's still considered a container of excrement. Now, you might have the law of a container of excrement.
If you see a pig go by, you don't have to see whether he just washed himself.
Right. Basically, just the conclusion is don't say Shema. Well, unless you hold like Abaye. You hold like Abaye, then you have there's room to be lenient. So it's an argument between Rava and Abaye. Now, the other thing, keep in mind, is this goes back to the other argument that we had earlier. Are we talking about it's in front of you or on your side? If it's on your side, then you only have to separate 4 amos from a pig, 6 to 8 feet. If it's in front of you, there's an argument. That was the Beis Yosef and the Torah trying to understand the Rambam. It either means you might have to separate the amount of space that not to see it, or it could be the 4 amos rule kicks in, and all you need to separate is 4 amos because it's only traveling, it's not stationary. With stationary, you would need to make sure it's not visible to you. Okay, so that's the law of the pig. Amar Rav Yehuda. Now comes the question of what about if you're not sure if there's a dirt. Safek Tzaya, if it's a questionable if there is excrement, we're talking about saying Shema, and you're not sure if the place is clean. So you have a suffix if there is excrement or not. The commentaries mention that it's also the same thing would apply if if you're not sure if it's prohibited excrement or if it's excrement that's not smelly, that doesn't from an animal that wouldn't cause there to be an issue. So you're not sure what either what type of excrement it is or if there is excrement there in the first place. Either one, the law is asura. It is prohibited to say Shema over there. Safek me raglayim, if you're not sure if there's urine, that would be mutarim, you would be allowed to say Shema there. Ika diamri, and some say a little differently. Amar Rav Yehuda says, Safek saya babayis, if a person is not sure if there's excrement in their house, then it's muteres, it's permissible. You can say Shema because most houses don't have excrement around. But be'ashba,
if it's in the garbage can, you can't.
So now, what do we mean over here? First of all, about the house. In the house, well, people that have children, does this? So the commentaries explain that even though a person has children, but the custom is that you clean it. So it's the house, even if there's children, and there is often there are accidents and so on, but nevertheless, it's still considered clean. So in the house, it would be Safek Tzaya Muteres, it would be permissible. And now comes the next case, Ba'ashba, in a garbage dump, that would be Asura, would be prohibited to daven there. You're not sure if there is excrement there, but because it's normal to have their excrement, therefore it would be prohibited. Now, obviously, we're talking about that there's no bad smell, because if there was a bad smell, then you would have other issues of dealing with the bad smell, and there's a source for the bad smell and so on, and then you would have other halachas. But assuming that we're talking about that there isn't a bad smell, that's when you would possibly be able to say that, when you would think you might be able to say Shema. And the Gemara here tells us, Rav Yehuda says that ba'ashba, it is usur, it's prohibited, even if there's no bad smell. Now, b'savik me raglayim, afilu ba'ashba nami mutar. If this is a garbage dump and you're not sure if there's urine there, that's what you're concerned about. Meaning, I guess that there's no excrement, but it was checked already and there's no bad smell. But nevertheless, we're dealing with urine. That would be a suffix. You're not sure. That would be mutarin. It would be permissible. So that's how this is the second way of the second version. Again, the first version was he just says a blanket statement, and the second version was he differentiates between a house and a garbage dump. That there's a difference between the house and the garbage dump, even with excrement. If you're not sure, in the house it would be permissible. Now, the next Gemara says, Savar law, Rav Yehuda holds. What's the source of Rav Yehuda? So the Gemara says, Savar law, he holds, Ki had the Rab Hamnuna. Of this, that Rab Hamnuna said. The Amar Rab Hamnuna, because Rab Hamnuna said, La Yasra Torah Ella Keneged Amud Bilvad. This is something we learned earlier, that biblically, there's a prohibition of reciting holy words while urine is streaming out. That would be prohibited then biblically from saying holy words. Torah and Shema and prayers. And that's what the Torah prohibits. That's biblical. Loi asra Torah ella keneged amud balvad. The Torah only prohibits urine when while it's coming out. A person would not be allowed to recite prayers. To the Rabbi Yonasan Rami. This is like what Rabbi Yonasan says, because Rabbi Yonasan found a contradiction. Rami means he found a contradiction. He asked a question there's a contradiction. Ksiv, it says in one verse, it says, V'yadti yalacha michutz lamachna. You should have a location outside of the camp, v'yatzasa shama chutz, and you will go there outside. You have to separate from the camp, and you have a separate place outside of the Jewish camp. And you go out there, and it doesn't mention that you got to cover what you have to cover your dirt. It just says you go out there, meaning when you have to do your needs, you have a place outside of the camp. It doesn't say to cover it. Uksiv, and then the next verse says, the Yasei Tiyalacha, you should have a shovel. And when you sit there, and then you should cover what comes out of you. You should cover what comes out of you. So the Gemara finds this to be, or Rabbi Yonasan finds this to be a contradiction. Like it's dividing it into two parts. That first is a place that you have, and then the second thing is that you have a shovel that you cover. So how do you reconcile this contradiction? So the Gemara answers, kan b'gdaylam, kan b'ketanim. That the difference is, it depends if you're defecating or urinating. So if you're defecating, you have to cover, but if you're urinating, you don't have to cover the urine. That's fine. Because the prohibition of reciting prayers, Shema, by the urine, it doesn't apply once you finish urinating. Only while the stream is coming out is a problem. But by excrement, it would be a problem to recite prayers. And therefore, the Torah tells us that you have to cover over so that people would be allowed to recite prayers and not have a problem. So Alma, what do we see? We see from here, Alma, we see it's Tanim la yasra Torah ela keneged amud bilvad, that by Tanim, for urine, all you have to separate. The Torah prohibits only when the stream is coming out, and hanafal liyara, but if it falls to the ground, then shari, it is permissible to say, to recite prayers. Shema. However, the rabbis did prohibit reciting Shema. But when did they prohibit it? When did the rabbis prohibit it? When it's definitely there's urine. But when it comes to a question if there's urine, then they didn't make their decree. So what comes out from here is that we see the rabbis took things one step further. So for urine, a person biblically would only be prohibited from reciting Shema while the stream is coming out. And the rabbis added one extra law, and that is that when if there's urine on the floor, you would be prohibited there as well from reciting Shema. But if you're not sure about if there's urine there, then you don't have to go that far. If you're sure, then the rabbis decree. The rabbis only made their decree when you're sure. And so if it's a suffix, if it's a question, then the rabbis didn't didn't say their decree. Now ubevadon. Now the Gemara says, so what is that measurement of how you like, to what extent the urine is there? You're sure that the person urinated there. Until when do you gotta wait? In other words, when does it disintegrate? When does it dissolve or get absorbed? Until what point, when you're definitely in front of the urine, ad kama, until when do you have to wait? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Kozman shematpichen, all the time that it causes wetness to someone that touches it. That's how long you got to. In other words, when it dries up, once it's dry, it won't get your hand wet when you touch it. So that would be the extent of how long you got to wait. V'chein Amar Rabba bar Barchana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba bar Barchana said this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the same thing, calls man shematpichen, as long as it is causing your hand to be wet. V'chein Amar Ula calls man shematpichen, as long as it's causing your hand to be wet. Now, it doesn't mean you have to touch it. You assume you could see when it seems to be dry. At least I don't think you have to touch it. Now, when Geneva, Mishmei de Rav Amar, Geneva says in the name of Rav, calls man sherishuma nicker. It's not enough that it looks more or less dry. It's not enough that it looks, that it seems pretty much dry. It's not going to get your hand wet, but it's more than that, that it's not recognizable that there was urine in it. And it has to be fully dry. Because even if a person would touch it and his hand wouldn't get wet, but you could still see that this area is a little darker color on the sand, and there must have, there was urine here some time ago. That's not good enough. It has to be that the recognition fades away. That's the extent. So there's an argument here. Geneva is arguing on the other opinions, and he's more strict. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, Shara le mare, let Hashem forgive Geneva, to Geneva. Let Hashem forgive him for saying such a extreme view, because that he says in the name of Rav. Tashta soya. Now we say that even excrement, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, there's a statement of Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. To what extent does excrement have the law of excrement? In other words, at what point does it dissolve and not considered anymore disgusting for the smell, for just being around? So at what point does it lose its extreme rules? So Rav Yehuda Amar Rav said, Kivan shakarmu paneha, once it dries out, mutter, it is permissible to say Shema next to it. May raglayim boy, do you think urine, you're going to be more strict than excrement? It seems shocking. How could you be more strict for urine that it has to be fully? You don't even see any risham, any mark. You don't see. And for excrement, it's even just that it's dried out on the outer part of it is dried out. That's already good enough for excrement. In here, urine, you're going to be more strict. So that is the question that Rav Yosef has on Geneva, tries to prove Geneva wrong. Yes, Ben.
I think Rabbi Yosef has a point because maybe if you urinate right after a rain, what are you going to wait, a few days?
No. Then it's the opposite. Then the you don't see the mark of the urine. You see. As long as the urine mark went away, you see the rain mark now.
Yeah, but the urine is still there.
I don't think so. The rain washed it away.
Right.
The mark
I'm not
got
saying
washed
the
away.
rain, it rained after. I'm saying if it rained right before.
Before. Oh,
the ground is
rained
wet.
before.
You don't know when it's going to dry out.
You got a tough. Yeah, that's a tough one. But the thing is, if it rained before, I don't know. Even according to the other opinion, if you're going to have it easy, because it's going to be wet. even, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but
It's
I'm
still going to
saying
be wet.
he's right that in the case of tzoa, you can see it. In the case of urine, you don't.
Well, that's not proving it, I don't think, because just because you can't see it, that's not a, that doesn't make Geneva more wrong because you found a case where you can't see it. That's not what proves it wrong. What proves it wrong is that the law is more strict in one, not the scenario would end up being more strict. No, just because in this scenario, becomes more complicated to recognize, that's not a reason to say Geneva is wrong. The reason why he thinks Geneva is wrong is because halachically, it doesn't make sense that the law of urine would be more strict than the law of excrement. But not that there might be a case where urine you won't be able to tell, and urine you're going to have more of a problem from than the excrement. You know what I mean? That's the scenario behind it. So his proof that it's wrong is because of the law it's not logical that that the urine would be more strict than excrement. Okay, so in any event,
what's Geneva again?
Geneva is the name of a rabbi. Now, the Gemara talks about why he was called Geneva or who he was. The Gemara says that he was a great scholar, but he used to fight a lot, and he would bother Mar Ukva. And in the end, somehow he was killed by the government. The government killed him. He was given over to the government, and they killed him.
What was he given to?
And what's interesting about him is he never said anything on his own. He always said everything by his Rebbe.
So who gave it to the government?
I don't know the whole story, but there is a Gemara in Gittin. I guess we could look it up, but it's about Geneva. I'm sure maybe Isaac has something on him from the Art Scroll book of. But anyway, I think let's go further. We don't have that much time left. We only have 11 minutes. So this is Rabbi Yosef's question on Geneva. Now, Abaye is going to prove Rabbi Yosef wrong. So now Abaye comes and says, "Why? You think it's wrong what Geneva said?" Amalei Abaye. Abaye says, "My chazis the samchas aha." Who told you to rely on what Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav? Maybe you should rely on what Geneva said in the name of Rav. Why are you putting more trust in one statement in the name of Rav versus the other statement in the name of Rav? So Abaye is asking on Rabbi Yosef, why are you proving him wrong from another? Who says one is better than the other? You're taking one rabbi and saying, "Oh, this guy one must be wrong because of that rabbi." But really, neither of them should be more more proof. And so each one, this one says that one says that. It's not you can't prove one wrong from the other. So that's a biased question. Who says you should rely on this? There's another statement. What is the other statement? Amar Rav bar Rav Huna. Amar Rav bar Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, soya excrement afilu kecheres asura. Even if it's considered like cheres, like earthenware, that it's that dried out, it's still prohibited. So maybe that's why Geneva says that urine, it has to, even the form, the mark on the ground has to be dried out. So he says that because when it comes to excrement, he even says that even if it's fully dry, it's still prohibited. So that is Abaye's way of refuting Rabbi Yosef and sticking up for Geneva. Now the Gemara says, "Vehechi dami tsoya kecheres." Now, what does it mean that it's prohibited, according to this opinion, that excrement that's dried out like earthenware is prohibited? So there's two opinions. Amar Rabba bar Bachana, Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba bar Bachana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kozman shezarka, as long as when you throw it, veina nefreches, it doesn't break into little pieces. That is considered, it's still too fresh. It's still it's not totally dried out yet, and therefore you would not be allowed to say Shema next to it. Vigadami, and some say Kozman shegoylala veina nefreches. Not if you throw it doesn't break, because even if you just roll it, it should break. That would be considered totally dried out. So the second opinion is obviously you got to wait longer for it to be that to that extent that it's totally dried out, that if you just rolled it, it would break into little pieces, and therefore that would be the extent of that excrement is no longer considered prohibited of saying Shema near it because it's so dried out. Amar Ravina, Havaka imna kamid Rav Yehuda. I was standing before Rav Yehuda b'difti chazat saya, and he saw that there was excrement. Amar li ayin. He said, look, I karmu paneha ilai. See if its external appearance is if it's hardened, dried out, then you would be allowed to say Shema. Ikadami, and some say Hachi Yamar. This is what he said. Ayin miplai ipaluye. Check it. Ayin, check it. See it. If it's if there's little cracks in it, if it's dried out, that there's cracks in it, that it's considered dried out enough. So he was obviously more lenient. Now, my havi Allah. So what is the halacha? Itmar. We learned in the base medrash. Soya kacheres. If it's dried out, amemar amar asura. Amemar is more strict. He says even if it's dried out, it's considered. If it's like earthenware, it's considered prohibited asura. And he follows, obviously, that opinion that we said above, that you have to wait till it either throw it and it breaks into pieces, or if it's rolled, it breaks into pieces. Or Mar Zutra, Mar Muteris, Mar Zutra says if it's kecheres, if it's dried out like earthenware, that's considered already permissible. Amar Rava Hilchas Tzaya Kecheres Asura. Rava says we're strict. We follow the more strict view that if it's Tzaya Kecheres, it's prohibited. Umeira Glayim Kozman Shemat Bichin in urine, as long as it is causes something else to be wet, that as long as it is still wet, that would be prohibited. But if it's not matbichem, if it's not causing something, your hand won't get wet, that would be permissible. So he's more strict on the tsaya, seems like, and he's lenient on the meiraglayim, because we had the two views. Meiraglayim either calls man shemat bichem, or we had the other view that it was rishuma nikar. And he says we follow the view of kolzman shemat bichem. That's prohibited. And once it's not wet, it doesn't have that wetness. Even if its mark is recognizable, it would still be. It would be permissible. It would be permissible, even though it's recognizable. Meisvei, the Bnei Yeshiva now asked the question on the words of Rava. Meiraglayim. So we learned in a brisa. Meiraglayim, the urine kozman shematbichan asurin. It says that it's prohibited kozman as long as it's still causing something to get wet. Nivlu, if it got absorbed, a yabshu, or it dried out. Mutarin, it would be permissible. Now, my love, what is this? What are we talking about? Nivlu dumya diyavshu. We must be talking about similar types of cases. I gave two examples, so one must be similar to the other. And we're talking about either it's absorbed or dried out. Now, absorbed would mean in the earth. Dried out would mean, let's say it was on a stone, on a big rock. There was urine. So dried out, it doesn't get absorbed in the rock, but it will get dried out. So we're comparing the two to each other. Ma yavshu dein rishuma nikar. Just like when it's dries out, you don't recognize the urine there. So also nivlu, when it gets absorbed, it must be talking about that you don't have any mark. Af nivlu dein rishuma nikar. Must be that there's no mark there either. So what would that mean? That if there was a mark, it would be prohibited. Harishuma nikar usur. If there was a mark, that would mean that it's probably prohibited still. So afalpi dein matbichin, even though it's not going to get anything else to be wet, it's just recognizable that there was urine. So he's trying to prove from this brisa that Rava is too lenient. And really, the halacha should be that it should be rishuma nikar. That's what he wants to prove. The Gemara now asks, not very good proof. Because look at the first sentence. You're skipping the first sentence and looking only at the second. So the Gemara goes back and says, really, it's such a question? According to your reason, Ema Reisha, read the first statement. Read the beginning of the brisa. Calls man shemat bichin. The brisa clearly says, like Rava said, as long as it's wet, it causes something to be wet when it's touched. Hu da'asir, ha rishuma nikar shari. clearly implying that if there's a mark on the ground that there was urine there before, it would be permissible. It would be okay to say Shema there, and because only when it causes something to get wet, matpichen, it's causing something to be teifeach, to have wetness. That would be when it's prohibited. But if it's just a mark on the ground, that would be permissible. So basically, you can't bring a proof from the end of the brisa because the beginning of the brisa seems pretty clearly the opposite. So the Gemara says, no, we can't prove anything from this brisa because each way, if you want to prove from the beginning, you could question it possibly from the end. If you want to prove from the end of the brisa, you could question it from the beginning. Therefore, you can't prove anything from this brisa. Lema ketanoi, the Gemara says, let's say this is an argument of the Tanoim, of the earlier rabbis, the authors of the Mishnah and Brisas, that maybe there's two opinions in the Brisas. In other words, we had said that these different views, one of them was Rav, the source was Rav, it was in the name of Rav, two different opinions in the name of Rav about soya excrement. And regarding the urine, we had Gniva, and we had the other names were Ula, and Rabba Bar Bachana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. So they were all Amiram. But the Gemara says maybe this is a machlekes Tanoim. If you have a vessel that it was poured from it urine, also licorice kriya shema kenegda, you can't say shema next to it. Omei raglayim atzman shenishpachu, and urine that spilled. Nivlu mutter. If they were absorbed, I'm sorry. First, let me read this again. Lema ketanoi. Let us say this is an argument of the Tanoim. Kli shenishpchu mimenu rei reglaim. You have a container that you emptied urine. You emptied it from urine. So now all you have is a container. There's no urine, except you have maybe there's a little. It wasn't washed out. It was empty. It was a kli that was emptied from urine. Now it's also prohibited. Also, licorice kriya shema kenegdo. You can't read shema next to it because it is miyuchad for it is set aside for urine, and that would be prohibited to say shema next to it. I'm wondering maybe if it was washed out, it would still have the same law. Maybe even if it's washed out. Just see one thing here. Okay, I'm not sure what the din. I think maybe even if it's washed out, it would have that law that you couldn't say shema next to it. Umei raglayim atzman, and urine itself, shenishbachu, that's spilled. This is the main reason why we're bringing this. Nivlu mutter. If it's absorbed in the ground, it's permissible to say shema next to it. Loy nivlu aser. If it's not absorbed, it's prohibited. Rabbi Yosi Amar Kolzman Shemat Bichin. Rabbi Yosi says, as long as it could cause something to be wet, it is prohibited to say shema. So what's the argument? My nivlu, my loy nivlu, the Kamer Tanakama. So what's the argument here? What does the Tanakama mean when he says it's absorbed? Ilema nivlu dein matbichen. If you want to say it means it was absorbed, that means it's not going to cause anything else to get wet. In loy nivlu de matbichen, and when it says that it's not absorbed, it means it would cause something to get wet. So v'aser Rabbi Yosi lemeimar calls man shematbichen, and then Rabbi Yosi adds, what would Rabbi Yosi be adding? He's saying, Kozman shemat bichen, if it's causing something to get wet, hu da'aser, it's considered prohibited. Ha rishuma nikor shari. But if its mark is recognizable, that would be permissible. So the first one is saying that as long as it's not causing something else to get wet, it would be permissible. And Rabbi Yosi says, if it's as long as it's not causing something to get wet, it's permissible. And where would so the Gemara asked, Hainu Tanakama, that would be the same as the Tanakama. Basically, they're saying the same thing. What is Rabbi Yosi adding? He's saying when it's causing something to get wet, it's prohibited. What would that mean? That if you could recognize it's not causing something to get wet, but you could recognize it in the ground, it would be permissible. So in other words, these are the same opinions. Ella, rather, we must explain that there must be an argument here because one rabbi says one thing, and then the other rabbi is obviously saying something else. Ella nivlu, because it's in the same paragraph, and we're presenting it like it's two different opinions. Rather, we must say Ella nivlu means dein rishum nikar. It's absorbed, but it's absorbed and it's not recognizable. In loy nivlu, if it's not absorbed, it means it's rishuma nikar. The rishuma nikar means it is recognizable. In Vasa Rabbi Yossi Lemeimer, Rabbi Yossi says kol zman shemat pichanu da'aser harishuma nikar shari. So the argument is if its mark is recognizable or not, that is where there is an argument. So again, if we want to just summarize what we've just said, we just explained a brisa that was unclear, and we explained that there's two opinions in this brisa, and these are Tanoic statements. Earlier, we said that this is arguments of the Amoraim, but here we see it seems to be, this is the explanation of this brisa, that it's all about urine. When does it lose its status of urine? Does it lose its status when it doesn't cause anything to get wet? In other words, it's absorbed in the ground, that nothing, if you touch it, it won't get wet. Or does it lose its status if it's not even recognizable in the ground, which is a later state that it's totally dried up. So that's the way the Gemara wants to explain this price. And now the Gemara says, no, everyone agrees that when it's causing something to get wet, it's prohibited. Harishuma nikar shari, but if it's recognizable, it would be permissible. Everyone agrees on these two things. If it's going to cause something to get wet, it would be prohibited. If it's recognizable that there was urine here, there's a little, the shade of the color of the ground recognizable, that would be permissible. But here,